only person who knows the truth about her dead best friend Charlie. And while she struggles to come to terms with what happened, she learns to appreciate her father, Ken, who uses the power of Zen, self-help books, and flowcharts to model coping strategies for his only daughter. Vera may be a pizza delivery technician, but she's also learning how to deliver herself. Please welcome A.S. King.
Awesome people. All right, I'm not going to cry. When I got my call from the Printz Committee on January 9th, I was watching the 1976 Candace Bergen episode of The Muppet Show with my daughters, and I was saying the same things I always say to them about the misogynist Muppet hick who's using Candace as a servant in the put another log on the fire skit. I say, what do you think about that guy? What do you think about how he's treating his wife? I say, girls, you gotta be careful. I say this stuff to my daughters because they don't understand that fiction on the Muppet Show is based on something very real, and they're too young to grasp that great satire often begins inside of darkness. Plus, it annoys them a little, and it's my way of getting them back for waking me up too damn early in the morning. I'm not a morning person. So anyway, Candace Bergen's character, in her awesome woman power t-shirt, I'm not sure if you've seen this episode, but it's amazing, you need to find it. In her awesome woman power t-shirt, has just shot open the door of the hillbilly shack and escaped the bathroom thinking Muppet guy when the phone rang. And I looked at the unfamiliar number on caller ID, and I bitched about how telemarketers should not call on Sundays. And then I answered it, and my life changed. And it felt like that part in a movie where the audience heart stops because something amazing happens to an underdog. And to tell you the truth, the whole thing still seems a little unreal. Don't cry. Okay. So first I offer a vow of gratitude and heartfelt thanks to the Printz Committee and to Yalta and to Booklist and to every single librarian, teacher and bookseller who understood what Vera Dietz was trying to say and who helped her say it to more readers. I also want to thank Paolo, Yanni, Lucy, and Marcus for writing remarkable books that remind me of why I do this every day. I want to thank 3 of my favorite guides, Andrew Carr, who found me a place where I belong after 15 long years of writing kind of weird novels. My agent, Michael Barrett, who keeps me sane and worry-free, and Topher King, who did me the favor of marrying me 20 years ago because he was silly enough to believe in soulmates like I do. Don't cry. Mostly, I must give an enormous thank you to everyone at Knopf Books for Young Readers, and especially to my editor, Michelle Fry, who made sure that Vera and Ken, Charlie, and the Pagoda all said exactly what they were supposed to say in the way they were supposed to say it. And to Adrienne Weintraub, Lisa Nadell, and Tracy Lerner for their tireless work with libraries and schools, and for getting me here tonight. In short, I'm awed, honored, and will be forever grateful to all of you who made this happen. I dedicated Please Ignore Vera Dietz to my parents. This was not a random dedication. When I was 15, my mother was admitted to the hospital one night in November. And the next morning, after a very early basketball practice, I went to the hospital with my father to see her. She hadn't slept yet because she was convinced that if she closed her eyes, she would die. She was 46 years old, and she had a lifetime of nursing experience behind her, so she wasn't kidding around. But still, we knew she needed to sleep. My father and I sat in the hospital room that Saturday morning and told her that we'd stay there while she slept and that we'd be there when she woke up. So she dozed off and she snored a little, and my dad and I kind of smiled at each other, happy that she would finally get some rest. About a minute or two later, a nurse arrived with some apple juice for my mother. Plenty of details to remember, apple juice. who needed to examine my mother right then, even though this was the first time she slept in 24 hours. And so the nurse gently shook my mother, and she didn't wake up. And then the shaking became more violent, and still my mother wouldn't wake up. And soon we realized the same thing. And soon there was an oxygen tank, and spotlights, and those beeping machines, and paddles, and the scene we all see on TV, and everybody said, "Clear!" And before they dragged us out of the room, I stared at my mother, and I was 15 years old, and nothing can prepare you for that. So my father and I were asked to sit in the day room, which was just across the hall and had a window in it, which was very, very ill-planned by the hospital people. But it was painted an annoying pastel yellow, and I don't know how long we sat in the room. I think it was about 7 trillion years. And then after 7 trillion years passed, the nurse came into the room and told me that my mother was alive again. And she asked if we wanted to walk down to the intensive care unit. And we did, each holding her hand on either side of the wheeled bed with the beeping machines. I was the only teenager there, and all of the adults were in shock. And I was in shock too, except that I was a teenager in shock in a land of adult shock. And things are different for teenagers, especially a teenager who had just witnessed the death and violent resuscitation of her mother. Don't cry. When I think back to that hour of my life, I realized that a little part of me died that day, and a little part of me was resuscitated too. And it was that part of me that became a writer and created Vera Dietz. My mother had to stay in hospital for a month, which left my father and me home alone. My older sisters being long moved out at that point. I think if I could have, I would have taken the whole month off, and I would have stayed in the hospital with my mom talking to her. But I couldn't. I had to go back to life, and had to go back to school, the way my dad had to go back to work, and we visited her when we could at night and on the weekends. One day during that month, this doctor, who wore those tan corduroy pants with the flying mallards on them, do you remember those? He sat me down in this room, and he told me that my mother would die within the next 6 months. And then he handed me a bunch of brochures, and then he got up and left. And no one wanted to talk about any of it. Not on my level, anyway. Not on that honest teenage, I need to talk about this right now level. Which was new for me, because my mother, a nurse and an educator for decades, never held back when it came to telling me the truth and talking about it. I watched world news from an early age. I started reading the newspaper before I left elementary school. In our relationship, questions were asked, and they were answered. It didn't matter how hard the questions were, they were answered, and they were never sugar-coated. It was my mother who taught me how to joke about the hardest things in life, and who made me understand why that Muppet Show satire was so funny. It was funny because Candace shot the door off the shack, and she escaped. It was funny because if we live through a thing, no matter how hard it is, we still have what matters most, our life. So dedicating a book about ignoring huge issues in our lives and our society to my mother, the ultimate underdog who is still alive 26 years later. I feel the same way. I tell her I applaud her too, it's great. But 26 years after I got that "Your Mother's Gonna Die" speech from the preppy doctor and the duck band, and to my father, who may not know the profound influence he had on me during those months I spent as a daughter expected to lose my mother any day, was a no-brainer. When I was writing this Ignore Vera Dietz, I thought a lot about that month in my house with just my father and me. There was something about our quiet understanding throughout the month and the unconditional love that we have, but we've never talked about, that somehow came through in the novel. And I was especially happy this reached my readers. Because so often in this business, we are told as authors what teens want to read. I heard a few times during my journey with Ken and Vera Dietz that teens only want to read about teens. And some suggested that I cut Ken Dietz and his flowcharts entirely. I see you all going. But as someone who once lost and regained a parent in the span of a few minutes, I know all too well the importance of adults in teens' lives. As teens, our worlds, whether we like it or not, revolve around and are controlled by adults. My life, and your life, still revolves around adults who control us with their laws and their budgets and their definitions And sometimes they're very small ideas of what teens should read. And I would like to take a minute to give maximum respect to all of you who fight daily the challenges from those people who think teenagers should grow up in a bubble. My inner Vera Dietz wants to shout, "What freaking bubble?" There is no bubble to grow up in for teens that's safe and sweet-smelling and full of happy rainbow unicorns, and there never was. Teens know horrible things are happening to people all around them. Not just natural disasters and political uprisings, but all those uncomfortable things that we don't want to talk about, like abuse and rape and child pornography and bullying and domestic violence. Teens see all of these things, and they know that most adults don't want to talk about any of it happening for real. And that's the part that hurts me the most. Because at least one out of 4 teenagers will experience one of those things. 1 in 4. And those teenagers will most likely be surrounded by a bunch of quietly uncomfortable adults who don't want to talk about it, and who will ask them not to talk about it either. To quote Vera Dietz, "I'm sorry, but I don't get it. If we're supposed to ignore everything that's wrong with our lives, then I can't see how we'll ever make things right." My mother had this great trick to bring up uncomfortable subjects. She used the newspaper. She'd find an article about something, say a drunk driving accident, or a child abduction, or a hate crime, and she'd explain it or read it aloud, and she'd say, "Now, what do you think about that?" And the older I get, and the further I get in my own parenting experience, the more I realize how genius this was. Everything a human can ever go through is right there in the newspaper. And if you use it the way my mother did, for a few cents a day, you can teach your kids about the real world without having to lecture them. And you can involve them subtly and earnestly without ever having to tell them what to think, because they will think it all by themselves if presented with the information. Honestly, I think the older we get, the more of a bubble we construct around our adult selves, and the more mired we become in how we think, and the less interested we become in the questions, because we're so busy knowing all of the answers. And I think this bubble world impedes so many parents from talking to their kids about serious subjects. To them, I say, find a book, find an article, find a librarian. Only thanks to a book did my 8-year-old last week talk to me about the Civil War, which led to discussions about slavery. Now, what do you think about that? And modern wars. Now, what do you think about that? And the physiological reason behind why the bodies at the Battle of Gettysburg bloated so quickly. Now, what do you think about that? Thanks to a newspaper, I learned that it wasn't safe to go walking alone at night. Thanks to a book, I learned that some men hit their wives and children. And thanks to a Newsweek magazine that I remember vividly, the cover, I learned that those little kids in Atlanta who disappeared when I was growing up were never going to come home. My inner Vera Dietz has never stopped reading and learning and asking that question. Now, what do you think about that? My inner Vera Dietz refuses to ignore all that stuff that makes most people cringe. It's not that it doesn't make her cringe too, it's just she's too busy cracking jokes with the survivors to pretend that they're not there. But my inner Vera Dietz, though she speaks loudly, is more gentle than she is badass. She came from a very quiet and lonely and frightened place, don't cry, that day back in 1985 when I realized that life is very precious, and when I realized that adults are very important to teenagers, and when I realized that our time on earth is far too short to distract ourselves from reality, no matter how ugly it is. Something important stayed with me from those few moments. I had no mother. Part of me stayed in that immature zone, where dreams can come true if you work hard enough, and where reality is exactly as it seems, and where cynicism has little power, and where soulmates can really happen. I'm very proud to say I still live in that zone, and I'd like to invite you all over anytime you might need a break from the bullshit, grown-up bubble world. Just drop in whenever you feel like talking about the truth that everyone else is ignoring. Stop by when you feel like asking, what do you think about that? Be prepared to laugh, and bring your library card. Thanks very much.